So in the interest of starting on time and staying on time, I think we're going to go ahead. It is, after all, 12 o'clock. I can say good afternoon. My name is Carla Hyland, and today we're graced with the appearance of these two gentlemen here, Russell Rowland and Robert Swartout. We're going to, on this fitting, beautiful late August, September day, I was going to say autumn day, but it's kind of late summer. Seems like a good time to take a closer look at Montana, so it's a pleasure to be here. Russell Rowland's first novel, In Open Spaces, published by HarperCollins in 2002, received a starred review from Publishers Weekly and made the San Francisco Chronicle's bestseller list. His next two novels, The Watershed Years, published by Riverbend in 2002, and High and Inside, published by Bangtail Press in 2013, were both finalists for the High Plains Book Award. Russell also co-edited an anthology, West of 98, Living and Writing the New American West, with Lynn Stegner. His latest book, 56 Counties, An American Journey, is about his travels to every county in Montana. Russell Rowland has an MA in creative writing from Boston University. He lives in Billings, where he teaches private workshops and does private consultations with other writers. That's Russell. That's him. And we'll move on to Robert Swartout, who has introduced himself to me as Bob, so I'll go with that. Robert Swartout is a professor emeritus of history at Carroll College in Helena, Montana, where he taught both United States and Eastern Asian history from 1978 to 2014. Professor Swartout was born in Portland, Oregon. He received both his bachelor's and master's degrees from Portland State University and his doctorate from Washington State University. Dr. Swartout served as a U.S. Peace Corps volunteer in Korea from 1970 through 1972 and was a Fulbright Senior Scholar in Korea from 1986 to 1987 and again from 94 until 1995. He has been a visiting professor on numerous occasions in Korea, teaching at Korea University, Yonsei University, Ewha Women's University, and Hankuk University of Foreign Studies from 1998 to 2008. He served as an honorary consul in Helena for the Republic of Korea. He was ex-recipient of the first Burlington Northern Outstanding Teacher Award at Carroll College in 1985. He received Carroll's Outstanding Teacher Award for Research in 1997, the Distinguished Scholar Award in 2009, and the Outstanding Teaching Award in 2013. He has served as a member of the original Governor's Mansion Restoration Board in Montana and was a member of the Board of Editors for Montana, the magazine of Western History from 1997 to 2013. In 2006, he received the Outstanding Educators Award from the Montana Historical Society's Board of Trustees. The Montana Historical Society Board of Trustees. In early 2013, he was awarded the Governor's Humanities Award by the state of Montana and Humanities Montana. And with those introductions, I guess I'll turn it over to the people you're actually here to see. Thank you.
Thank you. Russell, why don't you go first?
Thank you. I'm sorry, I forgot your name. Carla, thank you, Carla. And thanks for everybody for coming. I'm just going to read a little bit from my new book that's going to be coming out in April, but first I wanted to just talk briefly about how the idea came about and how the book happened. I was born in Bozeman, grew up in Montana, and then left for 25 years, so I had a unique perspective when I came back in 2007. I had lived in 12 different states while I was gone, and so I was able to see a lot of the country, and it was amazing how much it strengthened my appreciation for Montana, which I'd always loved. I wasn't one of these people who left because I wanted to leave, but I just happened to move somewhere else, and I just kind of always knew I was going to come back. And when I did, I just was so happy to be back, and But I also noticed some things, and I'd been gone long enough that I had changed a lot, and I noticed some things about Montana that I had either not noticed before, or maybe they had happened since I was gone, who knows, but I just thought, I became sort of obsessed with some of the things that were different than I remembered Montana. And so it's sort of become an obsession of mine that how the image that Montana has of itself sort of is conflicted with the reality. And so my book is sort of designed to explore the fact that the narrative about Montana, which started back when it was first founded, has always been sort of skewed, and there's always been an agenda, and so I'm kind of, the book is designed to explore that, but also to take a look at what the strengths of the state are now, and some of the things that are still amazing about it, so you'll see a little bit of what I'm talking about from this, what I'm going to read. I'm going to read the introduction and then a brief part of one of the chapters too. And so I visited every single state. I interviewed people everywhere I went. It was sort of a random. I did have some people lined up to talk to on my way there, but a lot of it was just going into coffee shops and restaurants and museums and striking up conversations with people that looked interesting, and it was an amazing experience. I loved every minute of it. So this is what came out of it. I have a secret to share with you. It's about this whole Montana mystique, the magic of this place. I've lived in 12 different states in the past 30 years, and I've always been amazed how people respond to the fact that I'm from Montana. Not always, of course. Some people can't even place it. They sometimes know it's near Canada, but many see it as just another small part of that big empty space between New York and California. But I've often come across people who say, "Oh, I love Montana." "Have you been there?" I ask. "No, but it looks so beautiful in the pictures. I've always wanted to go." For decades, the West, and Montana in particular, has developed a reputation as a place where you can go to start over, to create a whole new persona, or become the person you always envisioned. It's the kind of place where a week-long trip to one of our more picturesque locales fuels the imagination. The fresh air, the huge sky, and the wide open space instills in you a belief that anything is possible. It's a place where starting over can move from a concept to a reality in the course of a walk around Bozeman or a drive along Flathead Lake. But here's the secret. The secret is that we Montanans are completely bipolar. That's right, up and down like a goddamn bucking horse. Not all of us, of course, but as a state, as one big entity, we are completely bipolar. Why do I say that? Well, in February of 2014, Gallup did a survey to determine the happiest states in America, and Montana finished number 1. That's the image most people have. That's the idea you get when you visit this place. People are friendly as hell. They really do seem happy. You rarely get that shiver up your spine where the friendliness indicates some kind of slimy ulterior motive. People in Montana let you go first because it doesn't matter whether they go first. They smile at you on the street because there's no good reason not to. But here's the other side of it. That same year, 2014, several studies listed Montana in the top 3 for suicide rate. And for the last 40 years, we have been in the top 5 every single year. What the hell does that mean? How is that even possible? How can a place that is the happiest in the whole country... What? Well, that's one of the things I wanted to address in this book. For one thing, there is an inherent pressure when you live in Montana to be happy. Seriously, if you can't be happy living here, what the hell's wrong with you? But of course, it's way more complicated than that. Much of the explanation goes back to the very beginning, when Montana first came into being, or at least the current form of Montana, when it was settled. From the very start, the narrative about our history has been altered or often completely rewritten in order to support the actions of certain people or certain groups of people. From the start, those who wrote our history were so intent on shining a bright light on Montana that they ignored many of the pertinent facts, particularly the shadows. And perhaps the most troubling aspect of this phenomenon is that many of those who wrote or made movies about the West, and particularly about Montana, did not even live here. From the time Owen Wister came out with The Virginian, which is considered the first great Western, writers have been presenting the stereotypical Westerner as stoic, self-contained, multi-talented, and completely cool under pressure. But Wister was a lawyer from back east, a law school friend of Teddy Roosevelt's who came west a few times as a rich tourist. The American West was built around misconceptions and misdirection. And although most of us who live here know this by now, especially after decades of wonderful historians and journalists digging deep enough to tell the real story, many of these misconceptions still persist, not only here but worldwide, because they have become an important part of the American culture. They still justify certain behaviors. They romanticize the idea that men who ride into town and take care of business are the kind of men we need. The number of American presidents and other world leaders who have posed on horses or in various Western activities is hilarious and frightening, from Reagan to Putin. And it works. It tells the public, I'm a man of action. I can handle an axe and I look good on a horse. Look at Teddy. He was actually known as the cowboy president. And he not only relished that image, but he perpetuated it. Partly because it was based on fact. Because he lived it for a few years. But there was a dark side to Teddy Roosevelt's time out west too. And that contradiction fits right in with our whole bipolar history. Roosevelt moved here and built a cattle ranch when he was still in his 20s, after he lost both his wife and his mother on the same day, in the same house, from completely unrelated ailments. He spent the next several years immersing himself in a world of physical labor, raising cattle and hunting like a fiend. The number of animals Roosevelt killed in his time out west is estimated in the thousands. It doesn't take a professional to figure out that there was probably an element of escapism going on there. Roosevelt never mentioned his wife's name again as long as he lived, even in his autobiography. So you could say it worked for him, but none of us will ever know how much pain he buried over those tragic events, and it could very well be that what drove him to accomplish as much as he did. It is well documented that he was a man who couldn't sit still, and this is an aspect of the West that is still very much alive. So, why is it important to keep revising the real story of the West? Why can't we just put the past behind us and move on? Because too many people still believe the old stories, and because too many people still use them to justify their beliefs and actions, or to try to live up to completely unrealistic expectations of self-reliance. And because it's one of the factors that contributes to this high suicide rate. The stoic, self-contained man or woman who says little, needs help from no one, and pulls themselves up by his bootstraps. How the hell do you pull yourself up by your bootstraps anyway? Dominated the Western genre for so many decades that it developed a whole generation of people who fall prey to the idea. They can't ask for help. It's a sign of weakness. People will think less of them. And it's not what the Duke would have done. It's not what Calamity Jane would have done. And Clint would rather talk to an empty chair than ask for help. By the way, have you ever noticed that Clint and the Duke were never married in their movies? Apparently part of being self-sufficient is that you're incapable of being in a relationship too. In order to understand what is happening in Montana today, it's vital to understand how the attitudes and values that still hold true came about. Because these attitudes still shape the way we deal with both success and failure, and because many of the patterns that repeat themselves over and over again in Montana, both positive and negative, developed early on and have never changed. Some of this is simple human nature, but the more I read about our history and how these patterns continue, the more I am convinced that most of them continue because we've never acknowledged or resolved some of the more important omissions and inaccuracies from our history. Like most Westerners, we believe that if we ignore them, they will go away. And talking about them, forget about that. It would be an insult to many amazing historians and journalists to claim this book is a more accurate depiction of our history. That's not my intent. I'm not a historian or a journalist, so this kind of story is new to me. But what I do hope to introduce is a shift in that narrative, a slightly different angle to our history, in the hopes that we can inch a little bit closer to some semblance of truth and perhaps avoid some of the mistakes that have been repeated over time as we confront similar problems in today's Montana. Montana is an amazing place, but like all places, there are problems we can address to make it better. And the first step in that process is identifying what these problems are. More importantly, the point of addressing problems is not to focus on the negative, but to find solutions so that we can accentuate the positive, so that we can continue to be the kind of place where people want to live. If we become so enamored with our image of ourselves that we don't think there's room for improvement, we will never improve. Thank you.
I'm Bob Swartout, and it's a pleasure to be with you today. I think in many ways, this new book that I've been a part of, Montana: A Cultural Medley, really fits in well with what Russell has been talking about. In some ways, it's an attempt to look at Montana history from a different angle. The primary purpose of this anthology is a relatively simple one. The 13 essays contained in this volume have been chosen to reflect the richness and diversity of ethnic history in Montana. For more than 2 centuries, an amazingly wide range of people has made Montana their home. In the process, they have helped to transform the state into what it is in the 21st century. While detailing the diversity of Montana's historical population, these stories also allow us to gain a greater understanding of the everyday folk who helped to build Montana over the past 200 years. Almost without exception, there is no mention in these essays of governors, senators, or captains of industry. No presidents, no copper barons. Those figures who often dominate traditional narratives of state and nation. The people who do appear in these pages rarely rose to positions of prominence. Nonetheless, it would be a mistake to say that they were unimportant, for they were the people who provided the muscle that would fuel Montana's economic growth over several generations. Even more important, their efforts to maintain and foster distinctive cultural identities would often serve as the glue that would hold communities together. So what are these 13 essays about? The book does not attempt to be all-inclusive. That would be impossible in a book of 300, 400 pages. It's really a sampling of the richness of that cultural diversity, that ethnic diversity that I made reference to. It includes stories of a Scottish fur trapper working the high mountain valleys of western Montana, a Métis community in central Montana that would leave its mark over time, the great importance of Chinese pioneers who came to Montana in the 1860s and would dominate much of the state's history for the next 30 or 40 years, Jewish merchants, largely but not exclusively in Helena, who would leave their mark in many ways. The Irish of Butte, of course, but not simply the Irish, Hibernians. What in the heck were they up to? My ancestors, the Dutch settlers, who would leave their mark in the Gallatin Valley. Finnish immigrants in Red Lodge, who played a vital role in the rise of the coal industry in that part of the state. Slavs, who knew that there were large numbers of Slavic peoples in Montana. Slovenians, Croatians, who worked the mussel shell. In the 20th century, the role of Japanese immigrants and the toll that World War II took on them. And speaking of World War II, what about war brides who would come to Montana? A very special group, because they didn't come as families or as a community, they often came individually, which meant that they faced special challenges in moving to a place as remote as Montana. The Danes of the Beaverhead Valley. African Americans who would leave their mark on Great Falls. And Mexican Americans in the Yellowstone Valley. All of those are covered in this book. Not the whole story. The whole story is yet to be told. But it brings together these different stories, really for the first time, to have a book that focuses exclusively on that ethnic experience in Montana. There has been a tendency, both in Montana's history and in America's history as a whole, to view the experiences of ethnic peoples as being on the periphery of what might be labeled the mainstream historical narrative. This volume attempts to challenge that assumption. As the 13 essays that I've just mentioned aptly illustrate, the ethnic history of Montana is not only rich in diversity, but is also of crucial importance in understanding the evolution of Montana's history over time. Well before Montana was officially created as a territory in 1864, forces were at work, including the movement of native peoples westward to escape European penetration of the continent, the rise of the fur trade, and the expansion of international rivalries that would draw an increasingly diverse population onto the Great Plains and into the northern Rockies. The discovery of large deposits of placer gold in places like Grasshopper Creek, Alder Gulch, and Last Chance Gulch in the early 1860s attracted people from across the nation and from around the globe. According to the 1870 United States Census, the newly formed territory of Montana was home to substantial numbers of people from China, Denmark, France, Germany, England, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Norway, Poland, Sweden, and Switzerland. In addition to these groups, there would be smaller numbers of immigrants listed in the 1870 census coming from such countries as Belgium, Bohemia, Cuba, Greece, the Netherlands, Hungary, Luxembourg, Mexico, Portugal, Russia, and Spain. One of the most significant sources of immigrants to Montana was Canada, although it was hard to categorize these people because many of them were simply passing through Canada on their way to the United States. Moreover, they often represented a wide variety of different ethnic backgrounds that were not recorded in the U.S. Census records. In the decades to follow, substantial numbers of people coming from Japan, Italy, Finland, Croatia, and Slovenia, to name but a few countries, would be added to the mix. In one form or another, they were all drawn to Montana by the development of industrial mining in the silver, copper, and coal, by the arrival of the railroads, and by the expansion of Montana agriculture. The aggregate number of all these people streaming into Montana was astounding. According to official census records, foreign-born residents in Montana made up 38% of the territory's total population in 1870, which in fact was probably a low figure since the Chinese were undercounted. Those immigrants settling in Montana represented 29% of the population in 1880, 30% in 1890, and 27% in 1900. In other words, the figure remained relatively constant over those first 30 or 40 years of Montana's existence as a territory and a state. These numbers were substantial not just for Montana, but for any western state or territory within the nation. Indeed, among the 17 states and territories that range from the Great Plains to the Pacific Coast, get this, of the 17 states and territories from the Great Plains to the Pacific Coast, Montana in 1900 ranked second in terms of the percentage of its residents who were foreign-born. When the children of immigrants, that is, the second generation, are added to the total number, then the figure is even more astounding. According to the 1900 U.S. Census, 29% of all residents in Montana had at least one parent who was foreign-born. This meant that slightly more than 56% of Montana's population was composed of immigrants and their offspring. Well over a majority of those people living in Montana. Moreover, because these figures were for whites only, white was the term used in the census records, Asian immigrants, as well as Indians and African Americans, need to be included in order to get a truly accurate figure of the total ethnic population in Montana. Collectively, all of these different groups represented over 60% of Montana's total population. To state it somewhat differently, just 38% of Montana's population in 1900 was comprised of native-born Euro-Americans whose parents had also been born in the United States. It perhaps challenges our assumption of what it means to be American. And in fact, those figures would remain relatively constant for the first quarter century of the 20th century. It wasn't until 1924 when the U.S. Congress passed something called the National Origins Act and began to put severe restrictions on immigrants coming to America, and restrictions that were based on specific ethnic quotas, that the numbers began to then decline for Montana and for the rest of the country as a whole. But even through the 20s and 30s, a surprisingly large percentage of Montanans had either come from someplace else or were the children of people who had come from someplace else. What does that mean in the long run? It is crucial for students of history to understand that the past is never static. We need to be aware of physical change. We tend to be aware of physical changes occurring around us, especially if some time has passed between visits to a particular location. But societies and the traditions and values that bind them together are also continually evolving. This is especially true of ethnic groups situated within a larger community. If a group of people happens to come from abroad through the process of immigration, then the generational changes are particularly important. The first generation of the community is caught between two worlds. This is as true today as it was, say, 150 years ago. For people who emigrate to America as adults, their language skills, social institutions, and cultural values are largely determined by their country of origin. Settling in a place such as Montana, they are often confronted by sights, sounds, and actions that may make little sense to them, especially in the first few years. To cope with this feeling of living in a strange land, Immigrants have often attempted to create a community of their own that would reinforce this sense of community. And of course, within Montana, one of the classic examples of that would be something called Meterville in Butte, right? Now, if you don't know what Meterville is, you can ask me a little later and I'll tell you. The children and grandchildren of immigrants have faced a different set of challenges. Because of their schooling and their command of English, acculturation has been a natural process for most of them. But in part because they have been more fully integrated into the larger society, questions sometimes arise as to their own identity. Who am I? For the most part, they think of themselves simply as Americans. But they cannot completely dismiss the stories and traditions handed down by their elders. Nor, in some cases, can they always ignore the labels that others are inclined to put on them. As our society has become increasingly diverse during the late 20th and early 21st centuries, another interesting development has occurred, and that is the blending of once distinct ethnic and racial categories. The sheer diversity of the population, coupled with a high level of social mobility and an egalitarian spirit, have helped to blur some of the lines that traditionally divided Americans, and Montanans for that matter. The colors and shapes of ethnicity in Montana are much like those found in a medley of musical themes in a symphony. Each medley has its own unique characteristics, but when listening to the whole symphony, it reveals that the individual themes complement one another in such a way as to create an even greater design, a pattern that, at its best, produces an amazing level of harmony and balance. Thank you. Anything? Carla? Is Carla? Carla, I think we'd given instructions saying we were to ask one another a question or two to get things kicked off.
Yes.
Should we do that? Because I have a question for Russell.
I do too. Okay, go ahead.
In traveling through the 56 counties of Montana, especially given the fact that you lived in other places for an extended period, how has Montana changed in your mind? Or how have your travels through those counties maybe challenged assumptions you had had of Montana from your childhood?
Well, there were sort of two themes that emerged when I was on my trip, and one of them was that a lot of the issues that developed early on, and I can't wait to read your book because I think I'm not done editing mine yet, and I think I'm going to get some good stuff out of there. You know, in the early years, there was a lot of patterns that developed and that are still sort of repeating themselves now. And one of them was that, you know, the captains of industry that you mentioned became really adept in Montana at creating conflict within communities so that the focus wouldn't be on them. So, you know, it's, of course, the main one that we focus on usually is the Native American versus the whites, but there was way more of that going on with all kinds of different groups than most people realize. And so, you know, that's the main method they used to come in, make the money they wanted to make, and leave, and then everybody else is left fighting about whatever issues they've created, usually environmental stuff. So that was one of the themes. And then another one is that you know, a lot of the industries that Montana built itself around, logging, mining, and the railroad in particular, are pretty much gone. So we've got a state that needs to find new ways to create an economy that it can provide a living for its people. And, you know, it's really clear when you go around the state and talk to people that the counties that are clinging to the old ideas and thinking, you know, that we're eventually going to get back to, you know, having a small farm again, or, you know, getting a mill going again, or whatever. Those are the ones that are struggling the most, and the ones that are embracing new ways, tourism, or, you know, bringing tech companies into the state are the ones that are thriving. So those were two of the biggest themes that came out of it. Yeah. So I get the one question I would have of you is how, you know, it seems like, and maybe this is a misconception too, that diversity has gone by the wayside for the most part in Montana. And how, in your research, how did you see that?
Right.
How did that play out?
Right. Well, it isn't as diverse as it once was. I think that's certainly true. On the other hand, I think we need to be careful that we not define diversity simply along racial lines. In fact, during the years that I taught at Carroll College, I often told my students, remember this, that race isn't really a biological description, because human beings are all the same species. We might as easily divide people according to, say, hair color or eye color as skin color. That race is a manufactured determination. It's sociologically driven. So I think we need to remember that about race, but we also need to remember that race alone does not explain diversity. And I think if we move beyond just racial lines, we would be surprised to realize how diverse Montana still is in the 21st century. Obviously, Native Americans are a very important part of the Montana story. And there's not only, say, differences between Native Americans and non-Native peoples, but even within those Native American communities, there's tremendous diversity there as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
But there are also more people coming to Montana from different places, from different parts of the United States, and different countries than we often realize, maybe in part because they attempt to immerse themselves so quickly within that traditional Montana story.
Mm-hmm. I also was surprised to see how many of the smaller communities, especially in the early days, were primarily German or primarily Norwegian, or, you know, there was a lot of communities that sort of people migrated to their own, you know.
When I mentioned in the preface to this book that I hope the book will encourage people to delve into these stories in greater detail. The book doesn't attempt to be encyclopedic. That wouldn't be possible. And I didn't want to have just brief blurbs about different groups. I wanted kind of meaningful stories that would explain the human experience in what we know of as Montana. But there are tremendously important groups out there that have yet to be studied. Swedes made up a very important percentage of the Montana population in the early 20th century, and their descendants have remained in Montana to this day, and yet no one has looked at that Swedish experience in any systematic fashion. Same is true for the Italian experience in Montana. Or to think of it in more modern times, the Hutterite story, in terms of its historical description, really hasn't been told. Sociologists and anthropologists and people in religious studies have delved into it a bit, but historians have not taken up that Hutterite experience in any kind of systematic way. And of course, since we're in Missoula, we could talk about the Hmong people, the people of Southeast Asia, and their role in Montana over the last quarter century or so. That story is yet to be told in any systematic fashion. So I hope more than anything else that this book will sort of whet people's appetites to delve into these stories in much greater detail than we can do in a single volume.
When you traveled to 56 counties, did you experience people talking about that ethnic diversity as a basis for their stories today?
Not that much. Yeah, and maybe part of that was because I didn't address that. You know, it wasn't something that was sort of on my radar as far as the questions that I asked. But when I came back from my travels, I did a lot of reading, and you know, it showed up a lot in the history, especially in Butte. But yeah, it's interesting to think about that it didn't really come up that much in my interviews with people. Yes.
I just heard a familiar voice. I was going to ask if you ever watched The Back Roads of Montana.
Oh yeah, of course.
I figured you did.
Yeah. I'm hoping that he'll be asking me for, no, I'm just kidding.
You should have 56 back road stories
Yeah.
for each of the counties.
Ken?
Yeah, Russell, I can't wait to read your book. I'm just curious, you mentioned that we keep making the same mistakes.
Yep.
It's almost like we're repressing that reality.
Yeah.
Some of the mistakes we keep repeating.
Well, the one that came up over and over again, and you know, Libby's the most obvious example, and well, Butte, is that you know, we make compromises to with the corporations, and because people need jobs, and you know, they early on with the Butte mines, you know, all the farmers in the area tried to file a suit against the Anaconda Smelter Corporation for all the smoke that was coming out, and you know, they actually looked for a while like they were going to make some headway there, and then you know, the lawyers came in and hired a bunch of scientists to say that there wasn't any damage there, so they won that suit. And it's just like one instance after another where the corporations weren't held responsible, and they weren't far-sighted enough to see that if they paid the money for to make these small adjustments, or you know, make things a little bit safer, that they would make more money in the long run. They didn't have the long view either, and eventually it all explodes. It just happens over and over again. And of course, I look at the Bakken now and think, well, here we go again. You know, it seems like because our economy goes through these struggles and people get so excited about finally having jobs again, they don't want to think about it, you know. And so everybody sort of gratefully goes and collects their check, and people come in. The few people that are making a little noise about it are just, you know, yeah, don't worry about it right now, you know, maybe we can deal with that later. It just happened over and over again.
Sort of as a follow-up to that, you know, our image of Montana is as this rural state, you know, made up of these rugged individualists, right?
Yeah.
These folks who are out there ranching on the plains, and of course, I had a number of students over the years who did exactly that.
Mm-hmm.
But since 1960, a majority of Montanans have been urbanites. You know, so this is for more than a half century. A majority of Montanans are urbanites, and in 2015, the percentage is much higher than it was in 1960. So in many ways, this is an urban state with roughly a half a dozen urban populations surrounded by rural areas with an increasingly light population.
Mm-hmm.
But it's that rural landscape that sort of captures the public's attention when they try and figure out what Montana is all about.
Mm.
And Hollywood tends to reinforce those
Right.
images. So we don't realize that, in fact, Montana in many ways is a collection of these half dozen urban communities in an island of 147,000 square miles.
Mm-hmm.
And the economy is largely driven by those urban needs and those
That's
urban
true.
interests.
Another thing that was interesting about the smaller communities was that, you know, there's a lot of complaints about the government in the rural communities, but if you ask each of those counties what the main employer is, it's always the government. And you know, to go back to the environmental stuff too, you know, the EPA has put, I think it's $59 million now into fixing what happened up in Libby, and you know, that's taxpayer money. We end up paying for these conflicts that happen over and over again. And so when people complain about the government, you know, it always kind of there's a disconnect there, I think, as far as the reality. Montana's always depended a lot on the government. We were one of the higher, in the 30s, we were one of the states that depended more on the government than any other in the country. So it's just sort of an interesting. There's just a disconnect there as far as what people think and what the reality is. Yeah.
When you went to a different county, did you generally go to the county seat and
Yeah.
start there?
I went, always to the county seat, yeah.
And what is our smallest populated county?
I think it's Winnett, which is, I forget which county that is. Petroleum County, yeah. Winnett is less than 200 people. And I think the county's about 600 or 800 maybe. So that's the smallest. There's a couple of competitors, though. I think Rygate is less than 200 now, and Hysham is getting pretty low.
Dan,
There was several that claimed to be the lowest per capita income. There was like a competition. They wanted to.
I mean, that created some serious political problems for Montana, because according to the 1889 state constitution, every county would have one state senator. And so over time, you have tremendous malapportionment. Petroleum County, in the 1960s, Petroleum County with 800 people had one state senator. Yellowstone County with 80,000 residents had one state senator, which meant that a fairly small percentage of the total state population living in all of those rural counties had a majority of seats in the state legislature.
Interesting.
And ultimately, the federal government has to step in and call for reapportionment, because it violates federal laws at that point, the notion of one person, one vote.
So has that changed?
Well, because the 1972 state constitution then reinforces the one person, one vote principle, and that's why we have reapportionment every 10 years after the federal census is taken.
That's only the House. That's not the Senate still. Do we have 56 senators?
No.
No.
So they, counties had to be combined into a single seat in order to make sure that apportionment was following these federal laws.
that, of course, earlier was much like Montana and California in the federal model that's still in effect. 2 senators
Yeah.
for 1 million and 2 for 36 or 40, whatever California's gotten to. Bill, I had Bob, I had a question about the, in my mind, the communities, small communities especially, very rarely had African-American black residents in, let's say, the 20s, 30s, 40s, even until maybe the 90s. And yet I'm seeing more and more of the central Montana communities like Belt and Shelby and Conrad and so on with black residents, including, fortunately for some of them, darn good athletes. But it's quite a change that obviously has got to be related to the successes in civil rights and in, enforcement, but the perception of the people in those communities seems much more receptive now than it certainly ever has been.
Well, and as you know, Ken, in, say, up to the 1920s or so, most African Americans living in Montana were tied to sort of select urban areas. And that's because many of them came to work in Montana through the railroads. They either worked directly for the railroads or for businesses that were associated with the railroads. To the point where both Butte and Helena had their own black newspapers in the early 20th century. We've forgotten about that. But as the railroads, and Russell, you talked about this, as the imprint of the railroads would lessen over time, then those populations would decline. And a significant number of African Americans in Montana would move to the coast, to places like Oregon, Washington, California, during World War I and especially during World War II because of job opportunities that were out there. But then in the 21st century, to some degree, we're seeing a sort of a reintroduction of different ethnic groups into Montana, because these groups are also looking for a little slice of that Montana experience. That's where those images that the public may have of Montana can resonate with people who are perhaps tired of that congested urban living. And when it comes to the South, a number of African Americans, of course, a significant percentage still come from rural areas, from farm areas. So they wouldn't see rural Montana as that dramatically different. If you're a farmer, you know how to farm, and you can take those techniques to another area.
Just a follow-up, and that is, you hear statistics like a third of American West cowboys were either African American or Mexican, and yet I would argue that nowhere near those numbers were on ranches in Montana. I mean, there may have been southwestern and other states that totally distort that
Right.
overall figure, because it was pretty rare to find a black cowboy, although there certainly were some. But there was a period when I think African Americans literally weren't welcome in the small communities. The communities were not very good to them, although there are some distinctive exceptions. But they are now in a much, much more welcoming way, it appears to me.
I think that maybe reinforces the point I try to make when I say that history is not static.
Yeah.
And if we think that the values of today are exactly the same as the values or attitudes of 50 years ago or 100 years ago, I think we're really distorting history and the evolution that history takes over time.
You're right, though, there was a lot of blatant, efforts to drive minorities out, and I read a lot of the stories about, there was even unions would fine their members if they went to a Chinese laundry or, a lot of stuff like that.
Yet in eastern Montana, they were so homogeneous culture-wise, Norwegians or whatever, in a lot of the small eastern communities, there would be no chance for blacks to move into that area. They were all farm owners, and that was the whole, you go along the High Line from Plentywood, Mountainwood up in there. It was all pretty much homogeneous. There wasn't anybody but.
Well, I would suggest homogeneous maybe in a racial sense,
Yes.
Yeah.
but not necessarily in an ethnic sense.
Right.
And so you would have Dagmar, for example. You have a community like Dagmar that would really celebrate its Danish roots and other
Yeah, but that's all they
areas.
were. They weren't, you didn't get
Yeah.
any.
Yeah, Ken's right. I mean, there were so few black cowboys that they were actually mentioned by name in the, when you read these historical accounts. Oh, there was black so-and-so. And they always, of course, always called them black so-and-so.
We have about 5 minutes left, so if there's a few other questions that we can entertain, that would be great.
Kind of more of a statement, but I read somewhere that when the Grizzlies have a football game, they're the 7th largest county in Montana.
Yep.
Yeah, I was just gonna share an observation, which is you're focusing on that classic Western myth of the standalone individual. Many of the immigrant groups actually practiced a kind of communitarian social and economic system. You know a lot more about it than I, Bob, but the Chinese, right, they actually worked together. In some ways, they were far more successful, say, in mining in German Gulch because they worked together rather than as
Right.
individuals.
Well, I mean, that's true of the American West as a whole, that if you're going to survive in this often difficult environment, you're only going to make it if you could work with others, either within your own ethnic group or across ethnic lines. But the vast majority of Westerners were not as individualistic. Maybe they were as rugged, but not as individualistic as what the popular culture would suggest.
Yeah, Philip Auberg, I interviewed him, and he said Montana's always been way more interdependent than they've been independent, and I thought that summed it up pretty well.
On the suicide issue, I've lived in Sweden, and I know the Nordic countries, unless that's changed in the past 10 years, have been among the leaders of countries with the highest suicide rates, and yet Sweden's satisfaction has got to be high as far as standard of living and place to live and so on. So it's interesting, the northernness of Montana, maybe Alaska and so on, that may be a part of that suicide.
Well, and I talked to several specialists in that too, and there was the main factors they brought out was the isolation, of course, and the lack of resources. You know, there's one psychiatrist east of Billings in the entire state of Montana, and you know that's just one example of how few resources there are out there for people that need help. So that was another huge issue, and of course the whole, you know, buck up and deal with your own problems thing is just another.
Is there a statistical breakdown? I mean, aren't there people coming to Montana just to commit suicide? I mean, they go to California, they go to the Golden Gate Bridge. I mean, Montana is the kind of place where if somebody wants not to be found, the mountains, look on the map, you know, it's an American thing to leave where you are if you're going to commit suicide in some other place in the country.
I didn't think about that, but yeah, that might be part of it.
There needs to be a statistical breakdown of if it's not consistent with, you know, the nature of Montana, as it could be.
One thing that did surprise me, that, you know, a lot of people assume, well, the reservations must be part of that. And they do have a higher percentage, but it's not that much higher. And some of the highest rated counties in the state are nowhere near the reservation. So it's kind of there's a strange misconception there too.
One other thing I'd like to mention, because it shows how Montana is in fact often, it likes to think of itself as unique, but it's often tied to these national trends that are underway. In 1909, during the height of the Progressive Era, and Montana had a strong progressive streak within it if you look at Jeanette Rankin and laws that were passed in the early 20th century. But in 1909, the Montana legislature passed an anti-miscegenation law, a law that prohibited interracial marriage, marriage between whites, blacks, between whites and various Asian groups. That wasn't taken off the books until 1953.
Wow.
So again, it sort of reinforced the point you were making, Ken, that race is always just beneath the surface there and often would drive certain decisions that were made statewide.
Oh, looks like we are just at that tail end of our hour. I'd like to thank everybody for coming, and I'd like to offer a round of applause for these.
Thank you. Nice to meet you.
Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the festival.